Contains potential allergens including Aristotelian, medieval, and Renaissance thought, common sense, and traces of 2 dead languages.
Hi everybody, and welcome to today's contribution. This book here is the Bible of animal rights. It's by Peter Singer and its title is Animal Liberation. This lot here is the Summa Theologica and it is by Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is the pet fiend of Peter Singer. Now, if you're new to Peter Singer and Thomas Aquinas, here is a quick profile. Peter Singer is the world's leading public intellectual and philosopher. And most important, he is the father of animal rights. If you're into fishing, Peter Singer hasn't got exactly much good news for you. He thinks fish feel pain and suffer, and that therefore all use of fish must end. Fishing has to stop. We must stop catching them and eating them. The livelihood of 3 billion people depends on fish and fishing, and what happens to them remains largely in the dark. The main thing for Peter Singer is that fish are liberated from the suffering at the hands of those who fish. So that's about fish. About humans, he says the following, or thinks the following. He holds that a healthy chicken has an unconditional right to life, whereas a healthy newborn human baby has no such right. And he sums up his view in one sentence, and that is, there is no reason to say humans have more worth or moral status than animals. Thomas Aquinas, on the other hand, certainly wouldn't object to fishing. That wouldn't be a problem at all, and the baby would be perfectly safe with him. And his basic position is the absolute opposite of Peter Singer, and in one sentence it would be, there is every reason to say humans have more worth or moral status than animals. Thomas Aquinas is also called the angelic doctor, and he is the most famous medieval, or if you prefer, early Renaissance Catholic philosopher and the author of the Summa. Now, at first sight, Singer and Aquinas would seem to have very, very little in common, except for their Christian first names, Thomas and Peter. You could hardly get any more Christian names than Thomas and Peter. Peter, in fact, was a fisherman, and he was the founder of the Church of Rome, the Catholic Church. And I always wondered why Peter Singer stuck to his first name, Peter, because he is a high-profile and high-quality Christianity basher. About Thomas Aquinas, he writes, in connection with animals, Aquinas arrives at the often to be repeated view that the only reason against cruelty to animals is that it may lead to cruelty to human beings. No argument could reveal the essence of speciesism more clearly. So, please check out my video on speciesism. I have added the link below. And for good measure, Singer adds, Catholicism discourages concern for the welfare of non-human beings. So Aquinas is the ultimate speciesist and the top representative of the much despised Catholic Church. You could say, from Peter Singer's point of view, that Aquinas is Old Nick himself. Again, they seem to have very little in common, but big but in capital letters. They do have something in common. Peter Singer recently converted. No, he didn't convert to Catholicism. He converted from anti-realism to realism. So what's the big deal? Realism is the view that morality is objective. Morality is not based on culture, convention, intuition, sentiment, subjectivity, and whatnot. Morality is objective, like mathematics or beauty could be objective. Realism in beauty would be to say that beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Beauty in nature has an independent existence out there in nature. Beauty exists without human perception. Or think of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs existed for millions and millions of years, and until we discovered the fossils and tried to make sense of them. So then dinosaurs started to come into existence. And even if there never had been a human being, if we hadn't evolved, the dinosaurs would have objectively existed. And that is realism. It's getting seriously interesting now. Singer and Aquinas believe that reason can discover the objective basis of morality. Singer is an atheist and Aquinas obviously not. But in regard to truth, in regard to objectivity, that just does not matter. As Singer rightly points out, you don't need to believe in God to think that morality is objective, but that, of course, cuts the other way too. If morality, beauty, or whatever is objective, they, that is, Aquinas and Singer, will or should inevitably discover the same thing. Otherwise, it's not objective. And this is one of the reasons why I think that this debate, evolution, creation, is completely futile. It's a waste of time. Objectivity doesn't care from which angle it is discovered. However, Singer's realism doesn't dampen his enthusiasm for Christianity bashing. Among other things, he attacks a central concept of the medieval worldview, and that is the great chain of being. He attacks it because he says or thinks that it is hopelessly anthropocentric, it's hierarchical, and it reflects a completely misguided attitude to animals. So here is an example of the great chain of being. At the top is God and the angels, and then it's us, and then animals, and then all the way down to rocks and stones. And all of that is God's work. And because of that, that entails a moral obligation to all of creation. In this context, Singer also has a go at Saint Francis of Assisi. Now, Saint Francis was the guy who talked to birds and, who loved all of nature and all its creatures. And Singer admonishes St. Francis for this by saying, if we love rocks, trees, plants, larks, and oxen equally, as St. Francis does, we may lose sight of the essential differences between them, most importantly, the differences in degree of sentience. Sentience is the cue to Peter Singer's moral vision. Sentience is what it's all about. Whatever can feel pain and suffer has interests which we must take into consideration. And whatever cannot feel pain and suffer is of no moral value at all. As Singer says himself, a stone does not have interests because it cannot suffer. Somewhere along the line, Singer hit on the idea of the expanding moral circle. Here is the expanding moral circle. It expands from the self to the sentient beings. And beyond sentience, there is nothing. There is just nothing. But please note, at the center of everything is the human self, from which all values emanate, from which everything emanates. You couldn't get more anthropocentric than this. And if you pull up the circle in the middle, you get a cone, and on top of the cone is the human self. It's a perfect hierarchy. The whole idea of this expanding moral circle is hopelessly, absolutely hopelessly anthropocentric and hierarchical. And there is a funny twist here. Listen to this.
There could be other beings in the universe who also understand, who don't have human origins.
I think that is funny. First, you get rid of God and the angels, and then you introduce extraterrestrials into the debate. And I think that's truly 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. I also think it's funny that the great chain of being is actually more realistic than any of these animal rights philosophies. And the reason is that the great chain of being includes all of nature, and animal rights philosophies exclude most of nature. Having said all that, Singer and Aquinas share a lot of common ground. Remember now the Christian names I mentioned at the beginning. Now, that wasn't entirely facetious, because after all, Peter Singer is a cultural Christian. He is the perfect product of Christian culture, and the way he fights it actually entrenches that culture. Both Singer and Aquinas are deeply, deeply Eurocentric. They share their anthropocentrism and they share the hierarchical thinking, and they're both probably the most important representatives of their respective creeds. And they both believe in objectivity, and that reason points the way to that objectivity. And they both want to prevent cruelty to animals, and they both take recourse to higher authority, extraterrestrials and God. So there is much same here. Now, for the differences. There are few, but they are substantial. On one side, there is Peter Singer, focused on pain and suffering. That's the pathocentric view. And this pain-centered view covers about 10% of reality/nature, and I would call that the domain of pain. On the other side, there is Aquinas. Aquinas is God-centered, theocentric, and his view covers 100% of reality / nature, and I would call that the web of life. Now, you don't have to follow Aquinas all the way to appreciate that the web of life is the basis of human existence. And my point here is that Aquinas, for all the bad press he gets from Singer and heaps of other scholars, for all that, he does not stand in the way of progress. Quite the contrary. And by progress, I mean progress in animal welfare and progress in environmental issues. As I mentioned before, these medieval and Renaissance guys are miles ahead of Peter Singer and all these animal rights philosophies. And Peter Singer has still to discover that there is more to reality than just pain, just as there is more to fishing than catching fish. That's all for today. Thank you for bearing with me. Cheers.